Right now, we live in a world that's all about racism here in America, and it's even spreading over to Europe. And it's sort of the great myth. The great myth in America is systemic racism. Is it a legitimate argument? Not really. It's really a trope that gets dragged out every few years by the Democrats when they feel like they're vulnerable when it's coming up to an election or something's happening that's going to influence and drag away the black voter from their base. It's about votes and power. And if you don't think it is, we're going to go through a little history and talk about it a little bit because it obviously is. All right. Well, there's no doubt that the racism in America was once an issue. It really hasn't been for around 60 years, except for the Democrat Party system of dependency, which they created and is in essence racist at its very, very core. Was racism really systemic at some point? Yeah, of course it was. George Wallace, a governor, a Southern governor, a Democrat, he was a huge racist. He was a bigot. It got so bad they had to send the National Guard down there and U.S. Marshals to get him to let black folks attend public schools. It was just ridiculous. He became such a huge embarrassment that they actually had to act on him and get rid of the guy because the Democrats knew then that if he kept going, black voters would never vote for a Democrat ever again. So what they did was they just sort of ran him out of town on a rail. They ruined his career. But he was overwhelmingly supported by Democrats for decades in the South with all of his bigoted nonsense. It's really the truth. All right. Today, we're all enjoying this amusing spectacle of the left-wing protesters with the support of the Democrats wanting to remove, for example, all of the Confederate statues. What they don't talk about at all is that the statues they really want removed, Southern generals and Southern officers and Southern figures, they are literally 100% all Democrats. They were all members of the Democrat Party. Always keep in mind too that the KKK was founded by Democrats. 100% by Democrats, not the Democrat Party directly, but all of the people that started it were Democrats. The first head of the KKK was a Southern general who was a Democrat as well. It's kind of embarrassing, and the Democrats were building statues to commemorate these guys in the South, not only in the immediate years following the Civil War, but long after, well into the 20th century, into the 1920s and 30s. And that was at the time when the KKK was at its absolute peak of power. They had millions of members. If you owned a business in the South at that time and you weren't a member of the KKK, you refused to join, nobody was going to do business with you. It was a club. You had to join it, whether you liked it or not. And they cowed a lot of people into joining because they were all afraid for their lives. All right. And then they built all these statues so that no one ever forget how great these Southern generals were. And now they want to tear them all down because they don't want anybody to remember it. They don't want anybody to remember any of these statues. Even Nancy Pelosi wants one of them ripped out of the Capitol because he was a bigot and a racist, and it's a terrible reminder. My personal feeling is if you want to really make a point with these statues, put black shrouds over their heads and make people ask questions about why does that statue of that general have a black bag over his head, and you can explain that he was a Democrat, bigot, racist, and a horrible person. And while the Democrats love to lecture people about forgetting their own history, they certainly seem to be in a big hurry to forget about this one. Since the passage in the 1960s, 1964, of the Civil Rights Act, left-wing Democrats, in order to assuage their guilt of 150 years of absolute racism, 200 years actually with the plantations, you take them into account, they began to go into creating a litany of programs that, in the end, effectively perpetuated the oppression of the black and minority communities in the United States that they had thought they wanted to get rid of. And it was all done under the guise of trying to level the playing field for the minorities, and it failed absolutely. Funds were appropriated to build massive housing complexes to house black folks, and ultimately what can be viewed only as separate but equal environments. Funds weren't appropriated to improve schools much, to improve education, to really help anybody in the minority community. It was all about handouts and giveaways to provide a sort of a subsistence existence. They got food stamps or welfare for food, clothing and heating, and so forth. But they never gave them anything else. But the problem was when you coupled these small amounts of money and gave out free housing, it was enough to provide a subsistence, basically like a warehouse of living, breathing voters you kept alive until the next election. All right, and what you ended up with was basically an unbroken cycle of poverty for decades and decades and decades after the Civil Rights Act was passed. The unemployment rate and the poverty rate in the black community remained virtually unchanged for 50 years. And it's pretty damn depressing when you think about it. And during this time, unfortunately, because of the way the structure worked, the black nuclear family collapsed entirely upon itself. The rate of single-parent black households increased from about 19% in the mid-1960s, early 70s, to over 73% today. As a result, because there weren't any dads in the families raising sons, and I don't care what anybody says, a boy needs a dad. That's all there is to it. Street crimes accelerated upward for decades and decades as legions of young black males, they ran amok without a father figure. They formed street gangs within those government-funded housing projects. They resulted in rampant drug dealing, armed robberies, rapes, endless turf wars. And this happened throughout nearly every major city in America, and nearly all of them were under the control of the Democrat Party or Democrat elected officials, either as governors or mayors, usually both. And it's been just an absolute phenomenally bad situation. And you only need to look at cities like Chicago, New York, Baltimore, St. Louis, and this kind of thing, Detroit, and see just how bad the carnage really is. It's just awful. And by the 1990s, the black community themselves were begging for tougher penalties and prison sentences for black repeat offenders in their own communities. They couldn't live there anymore. These places become uninhabitable. There were sections of New York, the Bronx and Brooklyn, you couldn't go into if you didn't want to get your throat cut and robbed. It was absolutely a disaster. So the Dems wrote and passed under President Bill Clinton the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. In the end, over 3 million people in America ended up thrown in prisons. And a lot of them were homegrown Democrat Party street criminals, and they were all incarcerated. And amusingly, the bill was in part written by Joe Biden, who was one of the strongest advocates of this bill. Lock them all up, no excuses, 3 strikes, you're out. And the U.S. now has the highest criminal incarceration rate in the world. Our percentage of people in population in jail is even higher than South Africa. And South Africa is a total crap hole, okay, as they say. All right? The legislation was really badly written. It was excessive. It was overly punitive. It was just a bad law. And Clinton was so desperate to get reelected, he supported it. And but this time the Democrats had gone way too far because they were pandering for votes. They wanted to beat their chests and stand up in front of the black community and say, "See how we've saved you." What wasn't known then was what the long-term repercussions were going to be, despite some very severe warnings by criminologists and people that know the system. People in the prison world were saying this is really crazy. All right, so folks ended up getting massive prison sentences for trivial violations based on minor legal problems because it was their third offense. And this law took away judicial discretion, so the judges couldn't look at it and say, okay, yeah, 5 years ago you did something really bad, you broke into a house, and 8 years before that you did something else, but they caught you with 3 grams of pot, so there's no judicial discretion. You're going to jail for 5 or 10 years. And they had mandatory guidelines, and that's exactly what happened. So throughout the United States, on federal crimes and so forth, people were getting absolutely insane prison sentences for almost nothing, all right? And this thing that you have to remember, too, when you talk about crime in the black community, it's the black community that suffers the most. It's just and the members in the black community don't speak up enough about it. 95% of all murders of black people in the United States are done by other black people often in their own community. Okay, and you also have to weigh it the other way. Are the police racist? Are the police killing unarmed black people? Because that's the mantra that you hear constantly. The number is absolutely not. Last year, in 2019, less than 10 unarmed black people in America were killed by cops, okay? That's half the number of the number of white people who were killed by cops during the same period. And if you look at the statistics properly, you realize that you're much more likely to be killed as an unarmed person if you're white than if you're black, because the black community has 3 times higher crime rate. Has a much higher crime rate, has a much higher murder rate, has a much higher armed robbery rate, and the recidivism rate is I think 2 to 3 times as high. Okay, so what's the point? The point is that in the black community, it's all about race. It's political. It's all being made about race. And what happened was, in keeping people in line to vote for Democrats, of course. So what happened was, within months of Trump being elected, he began reversing that 1994 crime bill by reforming it and acknowledging how ridiculous and stupid it was. All right, and you didn't hear much about it in the news. It was a quick news cycle thing. He signed it. Okay, that's great. CNN, MSNBC, they all sort of went on their way. New York Times put it like on page 5, and that was the end of it. But for the Democrats, this was a huge shot across the bow. Okay, because the DNC knew what was coming next. And in public, they said little, but in private, they were absolutely panicking because this president that they had painted as a bigot was now doing something that is more helpful to the black community than anything they've done in decades and decades. The Democrats had spent the last 3 years, during the campaign, everything, Trump is a racist, he's a bigot, and all that crap, and now he's overtly helping the old reliable DNC black voter base by modifying this excessive crime bill. And he then began to push very hard to reduce the number of illegal aliens entering the United States, because illegal aliens come into the country, and they're the ones that take all the low-paying jobs, because they're newly in the country. It's not there's something wrong with them. It's just that that's how the system works. You enter a country new, you don't speak the language, you're gonna suck up all the low-paying jobs. Well, the black community was sort of in permafreeze at the bottom of the economic scale. So now it's even harder for black people to get jobs, even harder for other minorities to get jobs, other lawful immigrants to get jobs, because they're competing against people who are here unlawfully, and they're willing to accept anything to make a paycheck. And it began they flooded the market. Yale University did a study a couple of years ago, and they blew to pieces the old argument that there's only 10 million illegal aliens in the United States. They brought it in at around 21 million. And Trump knew that he had to thin that out. You can't keep going at this rate. You can't have 1 million people a year entering your country if you're trying to raise the economic circumstance of the working man. All right? So he's clamped down on it, and now the Democrats are freaking out about it, because what's going on is, since 2016, when Trump got elected, the black community, prior to COVID, but that's going to go away. The economy is going to come back fine. It'll just take some time. The black community had the highest increase in wages of any economic group in many cities across the country. It was double the increase in wages of the white community, because they were coming up from such a long, drawn-out period of not getting any help from the government. Now Trump comes in, he starts cutting down on illegal immigrants coming in, he's pushing up the economy, and black workers are going in and finding good jobs. Their increase in earnings have gone up considerably, and the unemployment rate dropped by about 50%. It's the lowest it's ever been since they began recording them. And I know you keep hearing that, and people go, that's just a statistic. No, it's a fact. All right, and people in the black community who are working and have good jobs, they know it. So what's the problem? The problem is the Democrats are losing control of their housing project pets that have been historically reliable every so many years. When the elections roll around, and they just go out and make some never-ending new promises of better times are coming. Just vote for us one more time, and so the mission was simple for the Dems. They've got to reverse this. They've got to wait for an event to happen, and then they can drag out the old racist tropes and blame Trump. Something has to happen. Some black guy has to suffer, and that's what they're doing. All right, they got to blame those Republicans, those racist Republicans, and make it Trump's fault, or he's going to be reelected, and that's going to be the end of the black base, because by the time he finishes 4 more years, black Americans are going to be enjoying an economic lifestyle and so forth that will help reduce the divorce rate, will help build nuclear families, and get things back on keel the way it should be. All right, nobody, regardless of their skin color, shouldn't have a fair shot in this country. All right, so what do the Democrats do? They know what they had to do. They have to do what they did back a few years ago. They need an angle. They need a hook. They need something to get groups like Black Lives Matter to work. They got to get them out there. 2010, when President Obama lost control of the U.S. budget, when the House flipped to the GOP, it changed things. No more stupid spending on meaningless green initiatives, no more cash for clunkers programs, all that sort of silly spending was gone. It was over with. And they began doing, logical, sensible, progressive things to rebuild the economy after the collapse. And as a result, the fiscal policy of the United States changed fundamentally across the board for not only black Americans, but for everybody as it began to rebuild. But something began to happen around 2012, a couple of years after the Republicans took over. The unemployment rate and the income rates and the job situation in the black community began to change. It started a little trend, and that trend scared the hell out of the Democrat Party. Wages among black workers were showing signs of rising, unemployment was dropping, and it was at an unusual rate. It wasn't just sort of on the curve with everything else, because they track all those things because they want to know what they need to do to keep black voters in line. And black dependency on the Democrat Party for their largesse was now being threatened. The Democrats knew what could happen here. After all, they knew more than anyone that 90% of the reason people vote and who they vote for is because of possible economic impacts on their lives. The Democrat Party even coined the phrase under Bill Clinton it's about the economy, stupid. That was the moniker. That was something they put out there, and it's something you should never affect. Money dictates how people vote more than anything else. As Tip O'Neill once said, wars and wallets, okay? And right now we're not in a war, so it's all about wallets. And to do that, you have to do one of two things. You either have to promise more handouts for people that don't have any money, or help people earn more money and become more prosperous. And that's exactly what's happened under the Trump administration in the black community. The handouts are drying up slowly, but jobs are becoming available. And when you have a job, you feel better about yourself, you feel better about your family, you're setting an example for your children, and so on and so forth. All right? Anyway, as an aside, I want to point out one thing that's sort of interesting. During the Clinton years, he managed to do both. Blacks and minorities in his first term were kept poor, basically, despite a booming economy. Their wages weren't really going up. Their unemployment rate didn't really move much. And meanwhile, non-black American citizens, white people, basically did really well. They did really well in the stock market. So he got plenty of support from those earning more money and the poor being handed more money. And that was really great. It got him going. And then after he got reelected, all right, in his second term, he no longer needed the black vote. And now he was focused solely on coming up and getting that famous budget of his balance so he could leave it as part of his legacy. He passed the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996. In essence, he screwed the black Democrat base. And if you were around then, you remember that. You remember how members of the black community are going, what the hell is going on? Yeah, well, it's because they've never viewed black voters as meaning anything to them other than a pocket of votes, all right? Anyway, I digress. Back to the BLM origins. Back in 2012-13, what to do about what they wanted to do about those lowering unemployment rates, higher wages in the black community. They had to come up with something to start undermining it because they were heading into another presidential election. They knew at that point, Obama was going to go out. They didn't view Biden at that time even as a slight chance of being a presidential candidate because he'd lost so badly every other time he's ever run, and he's sort of feckless and has never done much in Washington anyway except go along with the party line. So the Democrats needed an event or a situation to arise that opened the door for rallying black Americans back to their side against the Republicans. All right, that group, the boogeymen, that sort of thing, making the boogeymen out of the conservatives. The conservatives were then going to be painted as racist conservatives to push them all back under the DNC tent like good, traditional, loyal Democrats. All right, and on cue, a minor story popped up or was pushed into the news about a Latino guy in Florida who got into a fight with an 18-year-old black guy. And that black guy was killed, and he was Trayvon Martin. Soon folks were were being pushed to protest after that killing by all kinds of people, including the race-baiting famous lunatic Al Sharpton, who's been doing this as a career move now for decades and decades and decades. He's a total race baiter. He's a race traitor from the ground up. You remember during the campaign, they basically made all of the Democrat candidates go and go down on their knees before him and basically kiss his ring like he's the Pope if he wanted to get black support. That picture of those people lining up, pledging their allegiance to the black community in the shadow of Al Sharpton was all you really need to know about what Democrats think of black voters, and it isn't much. At any rate, suddenly Trayvon Martin's death became a race issue, zeroing in on George Zimmerman, the newly minted white Latino with the word white thrown in. Nobody had ever heard of a white Latino before that, but suddenly it was pulled up, added to Latino, and it became a white versus black issue. It was made up for the occasion. The rest was history, even though Zimmerman was found not guilty by a jury that included black folks. Nobody in the media reported on what actually happened and why, for very good reason, Zimmerman was found totally innocent. Was that Trayvon Martin had had the confrontation with Zimmerman when Zimmerman was wondering what he was doing, hiding up close to that house, and they had argued. Zimmerman had gone home, which was several blocks away. He was on his cell phone talking to somebody. He got to his house. He had been locked out because his mother and her boyfriend went out, and he was standing around in the rain, and the person he was talking to on the phone. Now remember, he's gone blocks and blocks. He can't even see Zimmerman anymore. Was getting angrier and angrier. Apparently he might have been high on something, but it doesn't matter whether he's high or not. Anyway, he decided to go back and confront Zimmerman because he was so furious. And he went back, and then they got in the fight, and then Zimmerman killed him. But had he not gone back, he would have never confronted him. He would never swung the punch at Zimmerman, knocked him down on the ground, smacked Zimmerman's head against the ground, and Zimmerman wouldn't have pulled out his gun and killed him. So therefore, it was considered justifiable shooting. And anyway, nobody cared. It was a black kid was killed by a, quote, white person, and that was the end of it. And then shortly after that, along came Michael Brown in Ferguson. And more protesting, more riots, when the totally fabricated story hit the media that the policeman executed him for no reason. And this was the birth of the hands up, don't shoot narrative that was totally fraudulent. They did autopsies. They examined the body. The family had an autopsy gun. The FBI had an autopsy gun. The state had an autopsy done. And all of them came to exactly the same conclusion, that Michael Brown was attacking the cop on the street when it happened. He'd already tried to grab the policeman's gun out of the cruiser. He was rushing back at the cop, and all of his defensive wounds indicate that he was charging the cop. The cop shot and killed him, because Michael Brown would have killed this cop. Michael Brown was a brute. He was a big, tough guy that had a bad history. He was not a good guy, all right? And the cop was found totally innocent, but didn't matter. Black Lives Matter and all these groups got going there, and he had protests, and Ferguson was basically torched, okay? And that was it. It was all phony. So here we are today. Trump beat down the Russian interference scam. The Democrats were relying that would be the reason why he'd never be reelected. And then we learned, just recently, the latest trove of documents that came out today. This is something very, very recent. There were 9 or 10 pages that were released by the FBI and the DOJ that basically said the FBI and the DOJ back a few years ago completely lied to the FISA courts, and they knew in 2017 there was absolutely no reason to investigate anything. They found out that the dossier was absolute crap because they spoke to somebody who was connected to a Mr. Steele that said, oh, no, that's all made up. None of that's true. But it didn't matter. They used it to get FISA warrants because they were desperate, being driven by the Democrats and liberals in the infrastructures of Washington to get him out of office, all right? And now here we are. So what's going to happen? Well, the Democrats have a problem. Pre-COVID, the economy was booming, and it'll come back. We're removing troops from Afghanistan. It looks like a peace deal is coming around the world. Things are going pretty well. NAFTA has been rewritten to the benefit of U.S. worker. China is finally being brought up to their the need for some justice on their criminal business behaviors, lying to investors, all the stuff that goes on in China, their abuses of Hong Kong. COVID cover-up isn't going to help them at all, but Trump is going after them for that. In the worldwide pandemic, and a lot of countries around the world, Australia, England, a lot of the major powers are cutting them off from trade. All right. And we also know now that lots of people in the DOJ and FBI, Peter Strzok, James Clapper, Brennan, Comey, they were all lying. They were just lying for years to try and get Trump out of the White House. And it was basically a coup d'etat. The black support for Trump since the economy has been improving has doubled in the last 2 years. All of this bodes really badly for the Democrats. So what do you have to do? You have to come up with a racist angle, because that's a hot button in America. And the Democrats, let's face it, are stuck with Joe Biden, who's a feckless old clown. I think really he's lost some of his marbles. But the Democrats have an empty bench otherwise. They have nobody that they can run. And many of their old stalwarts are being primaried by the far, far left within their own party at this time. The people tied to, AOC and the Squad. They just primaried out yesterday. A 30-year congressman in New York. He's gone. He lost in the primary to a middle school teacher or a vice principal of a school. All right. So how are they going to get some control back? Simple. They're going to use George Floyd's death as a rallying cry to attack police departments all over the country, at all governments, attack everybody in sight, the banking system, and start some riots, and all the time being protected from any criticism for the rioting that's gone on in Chicago, Detroit, Atlanta, New York, Portland, Seattle. I mean, people have been killed. Hundreds of millions of dollars worth of damage has been done, and the liberals and the liberal media are standing around saying, oh no, they're all peaceful protesters. Well, we've all seen the videos. We've seen the videos of mobs of kids running down the street, smashing windows, setting fires, burning stuff, attacking people in Seattle. The behavior, they say Antifa, some people is to this day saying Antifa doesn't exist, even though they have websites, they have a flag, everybody has seen them. The idea, it's like, don't believe your lying eyes. And these maniacs have been released by the Democrats, like the Kraken, to go out and disrupt things so we can blame Trump for it. Meanwhile, they're all working on behalf of the Democrats. And the mayors in Chicago, the mayor in Portland, are all saying, oh, well, there's nothing wrong here, everything is fine, even though film is getting out showing how bad it is, all right? And as for BLM, they've lost all credibility they've ever had, which wasn't much to begin with, but when they refused to come out foursquare against violence and street crimes, and they've said absolutely nothing about Black Lives Mattering in places like Chicago and other spots across the country where thousands and thousands and thousands of young black people are being killed. That little girl that was killed, she was out for a walk with her dad or something, was gunned down because some gang pulled up on them. Just ridiculous. And so BLM is just crap. BLM is a trash operation. And what's going to happen is that around the end of the summer, early September, as the Durham investigation comes out and these riots continue to cause problems, the police departments, the Association of Police Chiefs or whatever it was, the Patrolmen's Association just endorsed Trump for the first time. Everybody just assumed they were going to support Biden as they have in the past. They threw Biden right under the bus. Trump is going to get reelected. And the Democrats are going to realize how they blew it again by being so goddamn stupid, all right? Which is fine with me, because I think they're stupid and the party needs to be dissolved, all right? But that's where we stand right now, and we'll see what happens. But my feeling is that in the end, Trump is going to get reelected. Black Lives Matter is going to become a joke, and a lot of people are going to get hurt in the meantime, and a lot of them are going to be in the minority community, and I hope they remember who did it to them. Who did it to them.